Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Jinan Budge. Jinan leads Forrester's security and risk research in Asia Pacific. Her research focuses on enabling the success of the Chief Information Security Officer, creating transformational security strategies and building security awareness, behaviour and culture programs at the heart of a security strategy. You can read her full bio in the show notes, but for now, Jinan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Claire. I'm so excited to be here.
So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about toxic culture in security teams. And I know you've done a bit of research, so it'd be great for the listeners if you could tell us a little bit about what led you to conduct the research specifically.
As analysts, we tend to have research agendas, and some things are on my research agenda and I'm dead set on them. It's going to happen. This was not one of them. I actually collaborated with some colleagues. We first issued some research on reversing cybersecurity's self-inflicted hiring practices. My colleague Heidi Shea wanted to then follow on with that and talk about retaining cybersecurity talent. And the work that she's done in that space is amazing. She was talking about development opportunities. She was talking about the skills, what type of skills you can buy for what budget you have. And all that really cool stuff. And I'm like, just squeezed myself into that research because one of the things that I was really confident in from my experience from talking to leaders is actually that's all well and good, and remuneration and skills and developing people, super important. But one thing is for sure, that only goes a certain way. So you need to actually retain cybersecurity talent. If you're serious about the skills shortage, if you're serious about security, actually, you have to retain talent and you have to create a positive culture for people to stay in. So in our research interviews, we started asking CISOs the question about toxicity and how do you deal with toxicity. And some of the stuff that came out was just, it was just mind-blowing in that people are obviously so passionate about it, and everybody had obviously experienced toxicity in their teams, and they had strategies of dealing with them, and we knew we were onto something. I decided to, enrich the research. So I asked the question on LinkedIn, just a very quick one. Hey, what are the different causes of toxicity in cybersecurity specifically? Here are the 5 that I've got so far. I went out for lunch and came back and it went wild. And, we had 25,000 views and we had 200 people contribute. And the experiences that people shared, I have to tell you, it was both heartbreaking and enriching. It was heartbreaking in that I thought, oh, man, we are all experts on this. We have all experienced toxicity, whether we've been leaders, whether we've been led, and people don't talk about this in security. They don't talk about the impact that it has on their productivity. They don't talk about the impact it has on their mental health. And I think more broadly, we don't talk about the impact that it has on cybersecurity in organizations, on managing risks. I got a lot of private messages as well. The private messages were very much related to the relationship between toxicity and diversity. And no one wanted to talk about that. No one wanted to talk about it publicly. And I still haven't quite worked out how to draw the link, but I'm calling it, and I'm calling toxicity as something that we need to out at this point in time.
That doesn't surprise me about people not wanting to post publicly. But I'm really pleased they came to you in your direct messages and raised it with you, because it's so important for you to have the full, breadth of the argument. And that's not easy if people aren't posting in the main chat, but also don't then advise you privately as well. So it's really good to see that they felt strong enough to come to you independently through the direct messages so that at least you've got the data.
Yeah.
And one thing I was really surprised by your research to find was the number one cause of toxicity in security teams was a lack of organisational support. And can you talk through sort of how that came to be number one?
Yeah, and when I read that question, I actually wanted to ask you what was surprising about that? What were you expecting to be? I know this is my interview, but what were you expecting to be the number one? Because all of this surprised me, all of it, the whole thing. The responses surprised me. The top 10 surprised me. But what would you have expected to see as number one?
To be honest, I really expected number one to be more about the leader, and the leadership, and the culture that was created by that particular leader. Because I feel that the CIO or whoever's leading that security function at the next level up has a lot of influence over how the security team plays out. And the CISO for that matter, because they're the ones that are the decision makers essentially and have the authority and the influence. So I was expecting it to be the number one cause of a toxic culture was going to be whoever was at the helm. But then it was this lack of organisational support. So, interesting.
Which is so closely, and I love that. And I don't think it's an either or. So I see lack of organisational support as a huge leadership issue, actually, in cybersecurity, especially. Whose responsibility is it to get organizational support for cybersecurity? Absolutely, it is the whole securities team, but it is ultimately the accountability does fall with the leader. And in all of the top 10, actually, leadership wove itself in and out and in and out. What I do like about the top 10 is that I managed to break it down a little bit. Lack of organizational support, low leadership maturity, low role clarity. But on that lack of organizational support, it's really interesting. When I read data about CISO burnout, and I know that you have done a little bit of work on that in your podcast. I know I'm doing research on it. I've read research on it. One of the key causes of CISO burnout is actually lack of organizational support. And what is really important about being able to get organizational support in cybersecurity actually is being able to get the visibility, the influence, the budget that security needs. And without that, when you don't have budget, when you don't have visibility, when you don't have influence, you're not going to be able to create the cool projects or purchase cool tools. We know security people are tremendously bright, very committed people. They want to be working on amazing stuff, particularly when we're talking about retention. And how are you going to do that without the money, without that visibility? And also the other thing that I do note, and generalizing here about security people, is that we do work to a purpose. There is a lot of purpose happening. We want to protect our organizations, our customers, society. When you don't have that level of influence within the organization, when you don't have the organization supporting you, you're just, you're simply going to feel like a failure there. And you don't, all of the intangibles, such as you don't feel part of the organization, security is viewed as a negative or as a tax. Like that's not a cool environment for anybody to exist in. And sadly, security is often viewed in that way.
It's definitely a thankless task, often being at the helm. And you're right, we have done some podcasts about burnout. And I also just recorded the last episode for season 4, which is about retention and about having that support team around you. And, one of the key takeaways I had from your research was that CISOs have to take some responsibility for driving and maintaining the security culture. But, really what you're saying now is that it's actually up to the whole organisation to make sure that that culture is good and solid. And more than half of the top 10 that are in your research talk about leadership in some way. And so, if you come back to what I thought was going to be the number one, what if it is the CISO that's causing the toxicity and not the environment around them?
Yeah, and look, that happens consistently. And again, the responses that I received to my question on LinkedIn were not from CISOs only, it was from everybody. And a lot of people were in that directly or indirectly complaining about their CISOs. And in fact, this is proving and again, I loved that question so much. It's proving to be such a strong issue that we are kicking off research actually on CISOs leading their direct reports specifically, because in the past we talked about tension between CISOs and CIOs, or whoever the CISOs and their leaders are. But right now there is tension between CISOs and their direct reports or their teams. And when I think about it all comes down to leadership. It all comes down to self-awareness, and the importance of security leaders actually being people leaders. And in a lot of my research interviews, particularly when I speak to organizational coaches, one of the things that they mention is that at some point security leaders have to make a decision of being a technician or a people leader. And to me, that is such an important point. We've all been there in our career, particularly if you've been doing this for 10, 20, 30 years. I think we all remember that moment where you've had to make that decision. But I think a lot of people don't. A lot of people sleepwalk into their leadership positions and ignore all of the different implications that come with people leadership.
I love that phrase of sleepwalking into a leadership position. And I've talked before with other guests on the podcast about technical people moving into leadership roles and how leadership is actually not a task that you should only learn on the job. It's a task or a set of skills and capabilities that you need to educate yourself on and do courses and network with people and get mentors to understand how to be a great leader, and that a person who has been a great pen tester might be able to lead pen testers, but they may not be a great CISO, but they can evolve into that with the right set of skills. And, if they end up there because they're strong at what they do, they may not be a great leader yet, but they need the support to become one. And I'm sure that it can become toxic if they've put into a position where they're given a lot of power and authority, but they haven't yet been taught how to walk, crawl before they can walk.
Oh, without a doubt. And, one of the other pieces of research that we've done this year that absolutely blew my mind, I loved it. We talked about the future of the CISO, and we talked about the 6 types of CISOs. And, I remember, security as a leader, and we've all been guilty of this. Oh, they're technical, they're not technical. Like it was a very monochrome conversation, whereas now we are seeing 6 different types of CISOs emerging, compliance gurus, operational CISOs, transformational CISOs. But I think the key point to note is if you are, say, for example, an operational CISO and you take on a transformational CISO role, you're going to hate it. You're not going to do well. You're going to hate it. The organization is not going to appreciate you. All of these different things that then end up leading to you failing at your role. So, just having that self-awareness, what is your type? What is your leadership type? Does your organization need that actually at this point in time? And building your skills appropriately. If you want to be a transformational CISO, awesome. But there are certain skills that you will need to build to be that person.
It's funny because I often talk to my clients about the type of CISO that they want to hire and how there's lots of different CISOs and not necessarily using the same terms as you, but I use terms like, are they a builder? Are they a runner? Are they a change maker? Because I know as a security leader, I much prefer to come into an organisation that has some kind of security function already running. But I often find myself in consulting roles where, it's brand new. And that's not necessarily the strength of everybody. And so I guess the opportunity, as you said, to have the self-awareness that that if you're applying for a CISO job and you find out that you're going to be the only staff member there and you're going to have to build a team, write a strategy, understand an operating model, that's not for everybody. Some people want to come in and just be a runner and run an operational style security function and not make change and not, build things from scratch. And then there's others who like to just build over and over again. They spend 2.5 years or 3 years building up a function and then they leave and go and do it again somewhere else. And having that awareness, I think it sort of leads me back to thinking that the the state of mind and the current thinking of the CISO obviously also lends itself to toxicity, because if they're not in a good mind space, then how can they lead a team to be in a good mind space?
Absolutely. And it is, it's all about putting your oxygen mask on first, because if you're not breathing, if you're not happy, how can everybody else be? And people who are parents will understand this concept very well. Happy parents, happy families, happy children. It's same in the workplace. It's same in all aspects of our lives. But again, it's having these conversations, talking about the importance of this much, much harder soft skills. This is not what we're brought up with. I don't know what your background is, Claire, but I did computer science, maths at university. I did a commerce degree, business, people. It was something. I mean, I even had to learn English when I was 13. So language communication was something, and these are very specific skills that you build up. And I could have chosen to not learn the language so much and concentrate on my strengths of computing and maths, and I would have done really well in life, but it would have been a very different life than the one that I have now. It would have been a life where we would not be here on this podcast.
It's interesting you say that, because there's certainly some choices to be made, and I guess we never know where they're going to lead us. And understanding, as you said, knowing that you're making particular decisions for sort of your future strengths and capabilities. They're hard decisions to make because you're not sure if they're the right ones at the time. But if you've got the self-awareness to know where your gaps are, then that is the key thing, I think.
Yeah, and like you said, the impact on toxicity. So I know today we're talking about the topic of toxicity. So bringing us back to point, the impact of your behavior as a leader, how you're managing yourself, how you're managing your team has got huge impact on others. And again, we're all experts. We've all experienced toxicity from leaders. I presume we all have. Some of us have been lucky. And we know how important this is. So, and there are definitely ways to address it. As a leader, there are definitely ways to address toxicity.
That's a really good segue, because I want to ask you a question about addressing toxicity in a team that you come into. So, and I've talked to other guests about this as well, around, you come in and the previous leader that was there before you may have left things in disarray. What are some tips that you've got for turning a culture around like this and retaining some of your valued staff who are maybe a bit worn down by a previous leader?
I think the number one tip that has come out for me over and over again in all my research interviews on this is the importance of empathy and listening. Sounds simple, and yet we consistently forget the importance. I think one CIO said to me, "You've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them accordingly." And the concept of listening with an open heart and an open mind as well. And I know these are not necessarily words that resonate with us as security people. However, back to empathy, we've seen during the pandemic the importance. We've seen the leaders who have been extremely successful were the ones who are able to demonstrate empathy. They're able to communicate at the right frequency at the right time. So all of the, listening, getting in, understanding all of the perspectives, acknowledging toxicity. That actually came up as the number one to deal with toxicity. Acknowledge it. It is so easy to bury your head in the sand and, for whatever reason, pretend it's not happening. It's just, it's not an easy problem to deal with. It's quite intangible. It's, so acknowledge there's a problem. I'm going to deal with it. Understand all of the perspectives, the whole concept of empathy. Well, actually, you can coach that. You can encourage positive behavior.
Yeah.
We had one of the research interviews. The CIO mentioned the importance of, this is awkward now in the middle of a pandemic, having face-to-face meetings, picking up the phone, talking to people. It's so much harder to hate somebody when you're speaking to them than it is when you're being a keyboard warrior, which I'm sure we've all been guilty of. A lot of people talked about avoiding the blame game when projects don't go as planned when there's an incident, when there's a vulnerability discovered. I mean, I always hear of, he did this or she did that, and how could they have left all of these vulnerabilities open? It's like, well, actually, if you have the conversation, if you sit down and have the conversation, you understand the business impracticalities of patching everything 100% of the time. But it does require a conversation. And, I've mentioned all of these really lovely things about empathy and listening and talking, but there is room here to make the tough calls. And the number of times I have seen this topic just brushed under the carpet, I think this does require some courage. Sometimes you're not going to fix toxicity. You're not going to fix a toxic individual. You're not going to fix toxic behavior. The hero complex, that was number 6 on the list of causes, and that is alive and well in security. I've heard of chairs being thrown in rooms. I've heard of a lot of passion. I've heard of it's and sometimes you've just got to go, enough is enough.
So if we think then about the impact of a toxic person in a workplace or in a project team or in a security team for that matter, what about if we draw it right back to the start where you could avoid actually getting a toxic person into your organisation in the first place? Is there ways that even during the interview process you could identify that sort of toxic predisposition?
Yeah, I think it is a predisposition. Look, I mean, absolutely, there are ways, and the research interviews that I've conducted have suggested. I think there was a really good tip of asking somebody, what would you do in a certain security situation where people are not listening to you, you're struggling to be heard, and listen for the response. And if the response is collaborative and, I'm going to listen to them and bring the stakeholders on board, then I think you are probably onto a winner. And, and I've had those interviews in the past where people started banging on desks and, how dare they not listen to me? They need to listen to my perspective. Then you probably will know that that's not going to work. I think either way, these are 2 very extreme cases. I think we do need to know that a lot of people can cover up pretty well when it comes to interview questions. So it is about, trying as much as you can to explore during an interview, but knowing that, at some point you might make an error. I think during interviews as well, really important to check for cultural fit and trust versus only technical skills, which is absolutely the temptation.
I just want to finish off today. I try to keep the podcast quite evergreen, but I do want to talk about something specifically around remote work. And I've been told by some friends recently that they had toxic leaders in their organisation, and those toxic leaders have lost a bit of their bark because of the remote work. They're no longer in an office where, as you just said, they can't slam a table anymore. They can't get up in your face anymore. They can't use their body to tower over you or to, plant malicious seeds at the water cooler. What impact do you think remote working has had on security teams, potentially that had a toxic culture?
I would have loved to come here with a lot more research. I think we need to do a lot more research on this, and I still think it's early days in the remote working conversation. There's been a study that was just on Twitter this morning, actually, that was released by Microsoft. I don't know if you've seen it overnight. I'll send it to you afterwards, but it's super cool. But what the thing that came out, or 2 things that came out from it, is that this how to manage people in the remote world is shifting all the time. So, for example, at the beginning, a lot of people were struggling with productivity. So how to manage that is very different from now, where we've kind of all gotten used to it. We've actually, the situation has moved, not just, we're not productive enough, but a lot of people are overproductive. So it's a very different conversation that's happening with leaders. I think when I think about what's happening right now, leaders have got to manage a lot more stress. So I know that our data shows that 35% of us, this is Australian statistics, are concerned about losing our job. 32% of us are concerned that our company may not make it. When I look at some of our data around the priority of security, it is actually regardless of the size of organization that you are, regardless of whether you're an organization that's thriving or surviving in this climate, cybersecurity is a top 5, top 10 priority. I haven't got the exact data, but it's huge. However, we also know that budgets are being slashed, not just in security, but everywhere. So there's going to be stress on security leaders to do more with less. So security is still a priority. You haven't got that much money. So, do more with less. So I think leaders have a lot of challenges here. It's going to be really difficult to motivate people. Soft, again, I go back to soft is the new hard. So communicating with empathy, showing vulnerability is really important. You're right. You can no longer sit there and, you have to do this. I expect this from you, or bold, brave leadership. It's no longer what's working. So one of the things that we found is when, I have an example for a leader who was, struggling with this whole situation initially, and he had one of his leaders break down and say in a leadership team meeting, I'm really struggling with this. I'm really struggling with being at home. I'm really struggling with homeschooling. I'm struggling with the demands of my clients, which have increased. It allowed everybody else through that vulnerability to then be a little bit more open. And so, look, I do think it's bringing out the best and the worst in people. I do think it is bringing out actually the worst also, as well as the best, in that, leaders who were not great initially are struggling to find their footing. I think you had it in one of your podcasts. If you hadn't built trust with your team before the pandemic, it's going to be really difficult for you to do now online.
Anna Leibel from UniSuper, she said that in her podcast in season 4, that you really had to have already established those trust linkages and established boundaries with your staff already, because if you're trying to do that from a remote location, it is practically impossible.
It's really difficult, and it's seen, I know initially when this all happened and everybody, all the leaders started having, 3 check-ins with their staff a week, 5 check-ins, we all started having these virtual water cooler conversations and virtual Friday night drink things. And it sounded like a great idea to keep people connected. And it was, but what it did end up doing is actually making a lot of people feel micromanaged, feel a little bit fatigued. So I think there's a lot to it. And I think there's another element of one of the things I'm hearing a lot right now is during the pandemic, people, whether they're managers or whether they're team members, it's much harder to hide. It's much harder.
Yes.
So, toxic behaviour comes to the surface a lot easier than it did in an office environment. So I think there's a lot to that question that you asked. I'm not sure if I've managed to answer
Sorry, it was
it directly and succinctly, but it's such a good question. I think you could do a whole podcast and a whole research area on it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing everything, Jinan. It was great. It'd be really good to get the link to that Microsoft piece of research. I'm sure the listeners would love to read more about that. How can people find you or more about your toxicity research specifically?
You can definitely find me via LinkedIn, via Twitter, my email address, which I'm more than happy for you to share, Claire, my toxicity research, Forrester.com, and I've got the blog there, which is available to everybody, and then the more detailed research for our clients. But I'm always happy to talk about this because I'm always in a constant state of research.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today. And I'm really pleased with what you've been able to share. Thanks so much for joining me for today's episode. Feel free to listen to some of the previous guests on your favourite podcast app. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework, grab free chapters of my book, and sign up for my newsletter. If you love the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.